8-year-old Samantha loved drawing and artwork, going on adventures with her family. She adored dancing in the rain, and she lit up when surrounded by animals. But most of all, she loved spending time with her best friend in the world, her mother. But one day, Samantha returned home from school and found her house filled with people, and she immediately sensed that something was wrong. It was then that Samantha learned her mother had suddenly died from a brain aneurysm. And in a moment, Samantha's world was shattered, changing the course of her life forever. Childhood bereavement is remarkably common, yet tragically underaddressed. More than 1 out of every 20 children in the United States will experience the death of a parent or sibling before the age of 18. But parental and sibling death is only part of the overall picture. This statistic does not account for how many children will experience the death of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and close friends. When these relationships are considered, it's clear that very few of us will graduate from high school without having experienced the death of someone significant in our lives. Death is hard on all of us, but for a child whose sense of being is so strongly connected to a small handful of people, the death of one of those individuals is life-altering. And no child is too young to be impacted by death. It's been said that if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. Because other family members are overcome with their own grief, children often become what Dr. Alan Wolfelt has termed the forgotten mourners. The adult's grief is so raw, so acute, and the child grieves so differently from the adult. We fail to even recognize that the child is grieving, let alone know how to support them. We've all heard the adage, children are resilient, and it's true, children absolutely can be resilient. In fact, the majority of youth who are grieving, with the appropriate assessment and interventions, can and do thrive. But simply relying on the notion that children are resilient actually undermines how we support them. Resiliency is formed by creating an environment where the youth can adapt to the loss in a positive and healthy manner, and do so with immense support from their caregivers, peers, and other key individuals in the child's life. And while children can flourish when resiliency is promoted, ask any adult who survived the death of someone close to them during their childhood, and they will tell you how the lifelong impact of grief shaped who they are today and who they wanted to become. Imagine if our society worked together to provide understanding, encouragement, and love to children like Samantha, rather than being forced to address the downstream symptoms of anxiety, depression, poor school performance, substance abuse, and even suicide. After her mother's funeral, Samantha eagerly returned to school, but her teachers struggled with how to support her. Children spend the majority of their day in the classroom, so schools have a unique opportunity in both recognizing and addressing children's grief. But a national survey found that while 7 in 10 teachers have at least one newly bereaved student in their classroom, 93% reported never having received any training on the issue of childhood bereavement. And only 1% indicated that this training had occurred as part of their school or graduate level coursework. Imagine if our school districts not only tracked deaths during a student's life, but provided the training and the resources our teachers so logically want and need to support grief in the classroom. As the director of the Mourning Hope Grief Center for the last 7 years, I've had an opportunity to meet some really extraordinary children. When I first met Samantha, one of the things she said in a sad little voice was, "I don't know anyone else whose mommy has died." The National Alliance for Grieving Children indicates that this is a common theme among children's grief centers throughout the country. Even though the statistics indicate that childhood bereavement is widespread, children almost always feel alone in their grief journey. This is even more difficult for teens because a death loss separates an adolescent from their peers just at a time when they so desperately feel the need to fit in. Compounding this feeling of loneliness is that many well-meaning adults avoid talking about the deceased for fear that doing so will worsen the child's grief. But by avoiding these conversations, we model that talking about grief is socially unacceptable. If someone you know experiences the death of a child, spouse, parent, or friend, we shouldn't be afraid to talk to them. Use the individual's name. Tell them what was most special to you about the person who died. It's healthy for all of us to talk about our loved ones. We keep them alive in this way. Imagine if adults modeled healthy grieving practices for kids and created safe space where they could acknowledge their grief, talk about the person who died, and express their overwhelming emotions. Think about how our children's lives might be shaped differently if they never felt alone in their grief journey. After her mother died, Samantha shared that her friends were afraid to even talk to her. They were uncomfortable, just like we all are. We've all felt this way, not knowing what to say or afraid of saying the wrong thing, so we say nothing at all. We even avoid using the words death and died. We've created euphemisms, softer words such as lost, passed away, gone to sleep. But these words are dangerously abstract for a young child. A 6-year-old at our grief center was told, "Grandpa went to sleep and he didn't wake up." And then the adults in her life were confused about her sudden unwillingness to go to bed. And the little boy who was told, "We lost your baby brother yesterday." He spent hours looking through the closets and under the beds before someone finally realized that he was attempting to find his baby brother. While it's human nature for us to try and shield children from grief, I believe the goal should never be to prevent children from grieving. Grief is a natural human experience, not a problem we're trying to fix. It's a universal, healthy reaction to loss. Imagine if we all approached death and grief more directly. Perhaps we could stop depriving ourselves of deeply communicating with and comforting others in the face of a death loss. I have seen remarkable examples of this. During the opening ceremonies of our weekend-long camp called Camp Aaron, Samantha shared that every time she sees a butterfly, she feels as if her mother is still with her. And several days later, during the closing ceremonies, one of her new little friends looked up, saw a butterfly floating across our circle. She gently put her arm around Samantha and she whispered, "I think that's your mother watching over you." Pure beauty to witness. And the gravity of that 9-year-old's ability to companion her friend and profoundly connect with her will forever be etched in my heart. Moving through the grief journey should not be about letting go. It should be about finding ways to preserve and incorporate memories of the deceased into one's life. It's been said that death ends a life, but not a relationship. One of the memory-making activities completed at Mourning Hope is the making of comfort pillows. Each child brings a clothing item from the person who died, and then they cut, sew, and stuff the pillow into whatever shape or size they want. We have little kids who make tiny little pillows so they can stuff them in their pocket. And then when they're missing grandma on the playground, they can reach in and give it a squeeze. Teens are known for stuffing entire shirts, and they'll stuff the arms, they'll sew the arms, the base, and the neck, and then they'll wrap that big pillow around them as if daddy were still giving them a hug. And in Samantha's case, she made her pillow out of her mommy's pajamas because they still smelled like her mom. And at night, when she buried her face in that pillow, she could hear the words that her mother said to her every night before bed: "Love you to the moon and back." The challenge for our community is to give the issue of childhood grief the awareness and the resources it so clearly deserves. Our society has a huge opportunity to companion people through some of the most difficult times in their lives and lessen the effects that grief can cause for a lifetime. We can lend assistance to bereaved families just by the way we emotionally support one another after a death loss, by rethinking our selected words when talking about death and grief, and by raising awareness among caregivers, school personnel, and practitioners regarding how to support a child who is grieving. Sometimes grief support is as simple as lending a hand of encouragement, respecting the fact that everyone grieves in their own way, at their own pace, or through continued mention of the deceased's name to remind individuals that their loved one will never be forgotten. Imagine if we established an environment where it's not only acceptable to talk about grief, but it's understood that these conversations are vital to the holistic well-being of our children, our families, and our communities. And most importantly, imagine if, for children like Samantha, we created a community where no child ever has to grieve alone. Thank you.